Welcome to LeaderCast, episode 288.
Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
So, Tim, what industry do you think has grown in trust in recent years?
Sarah, in my thinking, there haven't been any.
You are really close. Believe it or not, police were the only industry that declined in trust between 2019 and 2020, and then grew in public trust between 2020 and 2021.
So with that in mind, the trust and confidence, I bet, didn't return to the same level, did it?
No, it did not. Out of the 16 industries that Gallup tracks long-term, every single one of them declined. And those industries include everything from public schools and churches to the Supreme Court, tech companies, small businesses, and big businesses.
And if I'm hearing you correctly about that study, there's a growing distrust with the church. And when we say that, it's not just a denomination. I mean, it's why we're having this conversation. The church, the trust in the church is declining.
Correct. This isn't about denominations at all. It's denominationally agnostic. It's the institutional church, denominations, independent churches, mega churches, small churches, rural churches, suburban churches, urban churches, churches with male pastors, churches with female pastors. I'll stop. The church. Confidence in the church grew in 2020 and then declined, with only 37% having a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the church. Less than 50%.
So may I say it in a different way? That means we have a trust challenge before us.
It sure does. And we're immersed in a culture of distrust of institutions in general.
Yeah, I read a statistic that 24% of the employees saw or knew of unethical behavior in their workplace. I mean, that's 1/4. But less than half, and that's in the last year, but less than half of them, 47%, reported it. We're cultivating a culture of mistrust.
And so here's another one. 74% of employees worldwide believe corruption is widespread among businesses in their country. 3/4! 3/4!
So those are some pretty alarming statistics, but it may give us a clue to what the world is, how we're living in the world today.
Yeah. So recognizing that this is the world that we're living in, and what people who make up our churches are experiencing, what people who don't yet know Jesus are experiencing, what people who do and do not have a church home are experiencing, what can we do as Christ-centered leaders?
So it's probably obvious that when I say we can't solve the world trust problem, but we can certainly seek to model, build, and galvanize trust with people in our mission field.
Yes. So today we want to talk about how, as Christ-centered leaders, we can impact the trust market. One, by encouraging authenticity and expanding our transparency, and two, by leading with competencies that inspire trust.
So here's the thing. When I say that, I sound like a politician. I hear them all say, here's the thing. Trust is good for everyone. And I know that sounds silly even saying it, because we know that it is, but it doesn't just happen. It needs to be cultivated. And we're all invested in the trust market, and we all get a return on it.
So let's start with encouraging authenticity and expanding transparency. My Brene Brown informed brain immediately jumps to, we need to teach people how to rumble with relational vulnerability, to create teams and organizations where people learn how to speak up and speak out in kind and caring ways, to share their opinions and to be heard. Rumbling with vulnerability is modeled in saying things like, I don't know, or I need help, or that's out of bounds.
Sarah, I've heard you talk about this on numerous occasions, a lot of times on episodes of LeaderCast. And here's the part I always like that I hear you say, so thank you for letting me say it. We're not saying it is to share personal information that legally can't be shared, or broadcast information via email because we have a small piece of data, but not the whole story. May I just add to that? If we do unto others as we'd have them do unto us, transparency becomes a whole lot more doable.
Yeah. And I would say what you pointed to, Tim, it's not transparency or authenticity. Some cases, it might be breaking the law. At the very least, it boils down to bad judgment.
So let me just go deeper in that just for a moment and say we're not talking about sharing dark secrets.
Right. And so maybe another way to think about rumbling with vulnerability is to think about rumbling with vulnerability as a way of creating a space with the people and the teams that you work with where everyone around the table has a voice and is heard and feels valued. And as soon as I say that, my guess is there are places and circumstances for you as you're listening to this that has been true. That was an intentional act by a leader to create that environment. And so as leaders, as we're talking about being who God created us to be, I think of authenticity as being able to share who you are with the people you live, work, and play with. I think of transparency as a commitment to not keep secrets and to share what you can share. As leaders, we are always going to be in a position that there are things that we simply can't share. And unfortunately, it's often for legal reasons. Saying both of those things requires a culture where transparency and authenticity are valued. Those two things are embodied in rumbling with vulnerability. So since I've already mentioned her, as Brené Brown says, you can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. This means having the courage to show up fully when you can't control the outcome. You'll be brave and afraid at the same time. When we're rumbling with vulnerability, we come to the table with who we are. When someone asks you how you're doing, it's not a casual greeting. It's a sincere question waiting for a response. Does that help flesh out what rumbling with vulnerability is?
Yeah, it does. It does for me. And every time we go have this conversation, I learn something new. And I'm thinking of it maybe not the right way is what we're talking about, but it brings to mind to me that the shift in leadership today is really to be focused upon people, and you have to be a people to lead. So we're focused on human beings, and so you're going to be human. And that means you're going to trust, and that means you're going to be authentic and vulnerable and transparent in healthy kinds of ways. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's all of the things I think we've sometimes called these things soft skills, and you can't see me making air quotes. I don't like that phrase because there's nothing soft about these skills. They're hard skills to learn. There are places that we bump up against as leaders that bring about challenges in the midst of our leadership. And I say that, and we'll probably talk about this more at the end of the podcast, but these are the places that I find myself as a coach, coaching more and more people, because people are trying to navigate all of these adaptive challenges. And it's one thing to talk about what the qualities are. It's another thing to actually embody it and put it into practice. And there's a whole lot of variables around that. And so how you do that as a leader has to start with what you said, Tim, is simply being human. You're not a robot.
Yeah, it seems to me, Sarah, in the conversations that we have and the people with whom we work, that the default mode is to always lead with policy or procedure. And we're talking about leading with, if I may say it this way, because we are Christ-centered leaders, it's really leading with love. It's really leading with what's the well-being of the people who are entrusted to us. Doesn't mean that policies and procedures aren't important. It just means they're secondary.
Right. There's a place for policies and procedures, but every policy and procedure has a person that's attached to it.
Right.
Every policy and procedure, there is a human being on the other side of it that is going to be impacted by it. So how it gets communicated, how it gets, enacted, how you lead through that, all of those things make a difference. And there are also things that can trip us up.
So with that in mind, we're going to share a list of leadership competencies and dialogue around them for a few minutes. So Sarah, I think you understand the list better than I do, but how are we going to proceed here?
As we walk through this list, keep in mind that we've said it over and over again already today. Part of the authenticity that you will exhibit as a leader comes from your strengths, comes from your experiences. And so this is going to look a little bit different for everyone. We're not focusing on how you go about modeling these competencies. We're naming them for you so that you can consider how you can embrace them, how you can practice them, and how you can use them.
So I'm the one that's slow on this podcast. So before we go to that list, we're really talking about adaptive challenges and more than transactional challenges.
Yeah,
right?
Wouldn't you say trust is an adaptive challenge? I mean, there's not a clear answer for how you...
Like I said, Sarah, I'm the slow person on this podcast. So,
how you build trust. I mean, we can point, and that's what we're going to get to here. We can point to behaviors that inspire trust, but again, what's happening in your context, it's going to play out differently. So let's start with one instead of talking around it. One of the competencies that we've already pointed to is the ability to build relationships that establish connections and transmit ideas and accomplish work. So break that down just a minute. The ability to build relationships. There's the human dynamic. There's the person on person. All of our warts come into play in the midst of that. All of our beautiful things come into the place in that. And so how, for example, I might establish a connection with Tim may be different and may look different so that he can then take those ideas that we're talking about and act on that to get his work done. That could be different than you, the person who's listening to this right now. I can't assume as a leader that how I go about doing that is going to be the same for everyone. But if you don't have the connections with a person and all you're doing is sharing ideas and saying this is what needs to be done, you're not going to establish trust.
What comes to mind for me is that if as a Christ-centered leader, you're leading with love, agape, working for the good of the people that are entrusted to your care, and we actually take seriously the scripture, which we live in a time in the church today where everybody knows the scripture better than the people who've studied the scripture. Wouldn't building relationships be part of who we are as followers of Jesus, especially when righteousness and holiness, from Matthew's perspective, is being in healthy relationships?
Yes.
So there's where we are. If you're going to be who God created you to be, you've got different strengths, you got different talents. But if you're going to be the leader God created you to be, you're going to lead first with love in the caring and development of relationships.
So carry that one over to the second behavior and focusing on development that really focuses on followers' needs, expectations, and aspirations. That's another example of leading with love. It's not about you, the leader. It's about the people that you are leading. What are their needs? Have you listened to the expectations that they have? Do you know what their aspirations are? And how are you helping them to grow in a way that meets those needs, that points to those expectations? Yes, all to get a specific job or role done. But if you're leading with love and focusing on those things, people's lives are going to change.
Yeah, you're going to be a person of care, of encouragement, of support. As you get to know the people with whom you're working, I think the words that we've used in the past, you're actually going to set them free to do what they're able to do. You're going to create a place where they can actually do the work that needs to be done. And here's a place, and I don't know if this is where it fits, but this is one of the things I've learned. This is not the place for micromanagement.
No.
This is the place for letting people do who they need to be. And you as a leader help direct that so that the work, the passion, whatever is moving toward the goal, the mission. So again, you're embodying the love of Jesus just by allowing people to be who they were created to be.
I'll say it pretty bluntly. I think micromanaging erodes trust.
Exactly. That's why you don't lead with policies and procedures. That's why you lead with love.
Yeah. Are we ready for the next one?
Let's go.
Being comfortable with leading change and organizational strategy in alignment with the vision. So every single one of us are leading through change. What might not be in existence is an organizational strategy or a vision to embody that. And so it's hard to develop trust when you're leading through change if there isn't a strategy that's being employed and there isn't a vision that's been communicated. Because, and it's probably obvious, people don't know where you're going. They don't know why you're doing what you're doing or what you're leading them towards. It feels like, on the receiving end of that you're simply stumbling around in the dark and things are happening willy-nilly if a strategy and a vision hasn't been communicated.
So may I be offensive here? You going to allow me to give me permission to be offensive?
Remember, I have editing rights, so if it's too offensive, I'll bleep you out.
I often hear some of our colleagues say that they've just thrown spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks.
That is not organizational strategy. Well, I suppose that is a strategy, throwing spaghetti against the wall. It's not often a very effective one.
And the other thing I think of here is that one of the things we've talked about a lot, it's because of who we are. It is using the hope cycle to help people get to where you want to go. Because you know where you're going and there are going to be obstacles. And so how do you help people who have the variability to navigate whatever obstacles or barriers are there to allow them to use the things they need to use?
Yeah, and
it may not be your way; it may be their way, but that's how you're showing your comfort.
And I think even in the times that we're living now, that things seem to be changing so quickly. This is where I would say, what are those core values that really guide who you are? Those things are not going to change, regardless of what happens in the world around us. There are some stable things that you can hold on to that if you're communicating that either through a strategy or a vision, people are going, oh, okay, we're trying to live into, let's just use the example we've been naming today. We're trying to live into leading with love. Here's what that looks like. Here's what it doesn't look like. How can we take a step towards that in a world that seems hostile and hateful at times? what does that look like in terms of our strategy for being Christ-centered leaders, both inside and beyond the local church? Okay, we could go on and on about that one. I don't know what was offensive about that, by the way.
Throwing spaghetti against the wall.
It might be messy, but I don't know if it's offensive.
Guess it depends on whose wall.
Or if you have to clean it up.
One of those competencies on this list was not having fun as a leader. Thank you for laughing.
Okay, so the next one is the capacity to inspire others by encouraging their efforts and celebrating success. And this is a big one. I'm thinking of another catchphrase from Brene Brown that we've used a lot on this podcast, and Tim, you have written about on the blog as well, and that's clear as kind. Once we're clear on who we are, what we're about as a church, once our mission is clear, set people free to live and lead within the bounds of that mission. The leader is not the gatekeeper. The leader communicates and inspires direction. And that's all going to build trust.
And I think if I said anything at this point, it would just be saying the same thing we've just said, but the other three. This is the biggie, but this is what we're talking about.
Yeah. It's probably the summary of the first three that we named. Okay, you want to tell us the next one?
Critical thinking that seeks information openly, invites dissent, and stimulates debate where needed. Oh, do we need that one today?
I think that one might be able to, we could stop it right after critical thinking.
Sorry, I'm laughing. I wish we had some critical thinkers.
Yeah.
We do have some. I just wish all the people with whom we deal on a day-to-day basis, and especially through some of the things we've been through in the denomination, has revealed the need for critical thinking. And as a leader, you really have to have a grasp of the total. You don't have to agree with all of it. You don't have to buy all of it, but you really have to understand most of it.
Yes. And we'll get to an episode in a few weeks where we're going to talk about rethinking some of the things that we've held dear. And I'm not talking about, the basic tenets of our faith, but, the things that we think about in terms of how the world works and who people are, and the things that you may have learned as a child, but you've had many life experiences since then, that we should be able to think differently. And critical thinking, at the base of it, for me, it invites us to ask questions about the information that is in front of us. And if we're not asking those questions, the rest of the behaviors on this, if we're not having conversation that's going to generate some debate to see what the holes might be in that information, whether you're in alignment with it or not, it doesn't matter, but you've got to test the data. You've got to ask questions of the information. Just because you Googled something doesn't mean it's true.
Yeah, it's another one that fits in the category for me of throwing spaghetti on the wall is, I learned that on the internet.
Okay, I have taken some wonderful classes on the internet, from the internet, that I have learned a ton. But you darn well better believe that I vetted the people that were teaching. I explored what was happening, and it wasn't just what were the top results on Google. And this is probably the thing that scares me the most about artificial intelligence, is that it has the potential to dull any critical thinking ability that has existed simply by allowing something else to spit information back out at us. And hear me, I have used AI as a tool, but how you use it is really important. That's a whole nother conversation for another day.
You don't use AI to get your information. That's what we're talking
Exactly. It's a great assistant to help you generate some creative thinking, but it's an assistant. It is not the doer.
So when I think of especially critical thinking, I'll use the old guy card here, that when I first started in ministry, there would be people who would quote to me, and this is not about the magazine, it's about the information and how people received it. There were people who would quote to me something they'd read in Reader's Digest and take it as total truth. Now, it didn't mean Reader's Digest wasn't giving truthful things. It was a digest of other materials where critical pieces may have been cut out to fit the magazine. But people would come with that as if it were the Bible. They would come with that kind of information. And we live in that kind of environment now with so much information coming at us. And unless we have cultivated a way of thinking and discerning and wading through the information, we usually just take what we agree with or what fits our view or our perspective. And then we go from there. And when we're talking about critical thinking, we're talking about really testing not only the material that's coming our way, but even our own thoughts. Because if we start with Jesus and we start with love, there's a place for transformation sometimes. Let me change that. Transformation all the time. But part of the reason I say that we need critical thinking is that even as Jesus followers, professing Jesus followers, we're not always starting with Jesus.
I'm going to move on to the next one, which I think we've also already named, but I'll state it so that our listeners can hear it. Communication skills that result in clear, open, and transparent dialogue that empowers trust. And that one relates to everything that we've been talking about in terms of these behaviors. And it also points to the last one, a need for accountability to hold yourself and others responsible for performance. It's the what's okay, what's not okay conversation. And how are people held accountable to what's okay and what's not okay? Opinion from Sarah Thomas. It's nothing but cheap grace if you communicate what's okay and what's not okay, and then someone steps outside the bounds and nothing is done. If you want to erode trust, that's what you do.
Sarah, so what I'm thinking is something that we've said earlier in this podcast, and I want to come back to it. And that is, these are adaptive challenges and issues and not transactional. We live in a transactional culture. It's very difficult to get to the place where we can lead and navigate the adaptive issues and challenges. But part of your work as a coach is to do that very thing. You know more about coaching than I can say, but I want our listeners to know what it is to have a coach and what it is to move forward in terms of the culture that we're living in and the shifts that we're making and the adaptive challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, as we were walking through those behaviors, part of what was running through my mind is, gosh, these are the coaching conversations that I have, because these are the challenges that leaders face. And any leader that is trying to build trust, the topic that we're talking about today, you're going to find yourself bumping up against resistance. You know, as you're trying to create an environment where people can, let's just say, rumble with vulnerability, that's going to be change for some people. They're not going to fully understand. Even if you communicate clearly, they're not going to fully understand. And sometimes if you're finding yourself throwing spaghetti against the wall and it's getting messy, that is where in a coaching conversation, you might come with a challenge. And it's not that I have all this wonderful knowledge that I'm imparting on you. I am simply asking you questions so that you can get clarity on your next step. And most of us, and I don't think I'm overstating this, unless you are abusing your spouse by downloading everything that you're doing at work in the day, we don't have people that we can be in dialogue about our own leadership and our own leadership behaviors to make the adjustments once we've practiced something, once we've made a misstep, to then get back on track and continue to make progress. And that's what a coaching conversation does. It helps you reorient yourself so that you can keep moving and continue making progress. It's part of why you've heard me say everybody needs a coach. I'm not just saying that. I truly believe it, because we all are better when we have other people around us that we can be in dialogue with around the things that are important, around the things that are sticky situations for us, around the things that we're trying to lead people towards and we're not quite sure what our next step should be. What I would say to you as a coach is you already know. And in that coaching conversation, we're going to figure it out. You're going to figure it out simply because I'm going to ask you questions and you're going to come to the place of clarity.
So you've just illustrated and modeled for us the difference between coaching in a transactional world and coaching in an adaptive world. Because much of what we've done in the church is to provide coaching in a transactional world, because somebody needs help. And so we're going to offer somebody help. And the coaching is, this is what you need to do. And what
that's not coaching. I'm sorry for interrupting you. That's not coaching.
Thanks for straightening me out. Because that's the reason I asked the question, is that what we're really talking about is having somebody who can come alongside us and help us develop the trust that we need to have as those Christ-centered leaders. And it's by asking the questions that need to be asked in a non-judgmental, actually, what you do as a coach is to model the competencies we've talked about on this podcast.
Right.
So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I wanted people to know that there is a resource called coaching, and there's somebody they know who they hear their voice every week. That's Sarah Thomas, who's a coach.
Yes. It is in formal and informal ways. It is where I spend a majority of my week. So are there any final thoughts that you have, Tim?
Well, with what we just talked about, Sarah, I need a coach. And
reach out to us at connect@transformingmission.org and we'll be happy to set up a call.
And thank you for that. I think one of the things that we as Christ-centered leaders assume is that because we say we're followers of Jesus, people just trust us. And that what we've talked about today is that there's been a great eroding of that trust, because it's more about being a part today. The shift is it's been more a part about being a part of an institution which is losing trust than it is about being a trustworthy person developing relationships. And part of our witness as followers of Jesus is to develop those loving relationships. And it sounds funny when we talk about leadership in the workplace and stuff, loving relationships, but it is who we are as followers of Jesus. And what I've, again, learned through even this podcast and putting you on the spot is that we're not alone in this. And it's not just the community of faith, because I've spent many years as a pastor. I can be alone in the midst of a lot of people. There are people who can come alongside us and help us be the people God created us to be as we lead others. And so thank you for letting me put you on the spot about the coaching.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us for episode 288. As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode, including links to resources that we've mentioned in this episode and information about coaching at transformingmission.org/288. And remember, who you are is how you lead. Bye for now.